The 11th floor of Seorak Medical Center was the quietest place in the building, and Kim Ji-ho hated quiet. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with a backpack 2 sizes too big and a scab on his knee he'd been picking at since Tuesday. He was not supposed to be on the 11th floor. He was supposed to be in the staff break room on the 3rd floor, doing his homework, waiting for his mother's shift to end at 7. But the elevator had opened on the wrong number, and Ji-ho, who believed doors were suggestions, had gotten off anyway. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, something like dust that had learned to be very still. Room 1109 had its door open a crack. Through the gap, Ji-ho could see a man lying in a bed surrounded by machines that blinked in colors he didn't have names for. Pale green, a soft, insistent amber, a red so small it looked almost apologetic. Tubes ran into the man's arm. A ventilator breathed for him in long mechanical sighs. There was no one else in the room. No flowers. No cards taped to the window. No half-eaten fruit going brown on the side table the way there was in every other room Ji-ho had peeked into that afternoon, chasing the sound of a television down the hall. Just the machines, and the man, and a folded blanket at the foot of the bed that had never been used. Ji-ho stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he did the thing that would end up on the front page of 3 newspapers 4 months later. Though of course he had no way of knowing that yet, and wouldn't have cared if he had. He walked in and sat down in the visitor's chair. "You don't have anybody either, huh?" he said. The machines answered in their steady, indifferent rhythm. Ji-ho unzipped his backpack and pulled out a battered volume of Dooley the Little Dinosaur, its cover taped at the spine, and opened it to the dog-eared page where he'd left off the night before, reading it alone in his room because his mother had been too tired to do the voices. "I'll do the voices," he told the man in the bed, as if this settled something important between them. "My dad used to do the voices. He was really good at the mean landlord guy." He did the mean landlord guy. He did the mother's voice, high and scolding, and then Dooley's voice, which he'd decided should sound like a kid trying to sound tough and failing. He read for 11 minutes, glancing up now and then at the man's slack, unmoving face, at the neat silver hair combed flat against the pillow by some nurse who had nothing better and nothing worse to do with her afternoon. He was on the page where Dooley gets thrown out of the house again when a monitor beside the bed gave a small double beep, different from its usual rhythm, and a young nurse pushed the door open so fast it bounced off the stopper. "Who are you? You can't be in here." She stopped, staring at the monitor, then at the boy, then back at the monitor. "Did you touch anything?" "No." Ji-ho held up the comic book like evidence. "I was just reading." The nurse's name was Nurse Ha-yoon, and she would spend the rest of the week trying to explain to the attending physician why Chairman Han Tae-young's resting heart rate had dropped 4 points and stabilized into the calmest rhythm it had shown in 4 months. For the 11 minutes a 9-year-old boy sat in a chair no one else had sat in since March, reading a comic book about a green dinosaur to a man the entire country believed was already halfway gone. "You need to leave," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "This patient, he's very important. His family." "Where's his family?" Ji-ho asked, closing the comic book on his thumb to keep his place. "How come nobody visits him?" Nurse Ha-yoon opened her mouth and then closed it, because she didn't actually have an answer she was willing to say out loud to a child. In 4 months, exactly 1 person had signed the visitor log for Chairman Han Tae-young of the Jinsung Group, his company's legal counsel. Twice, both times for less than 10 minutes, both times with documents rather than flowers. "It's complicated," she said finally. "That's what my mom says about my dad," Ji-ho said. "It's never actually complicated. It's just sad, and nobody wants to say it." He looked back at the man in the bed, at the stillness of him, the particular loneliness of a body being kept alive by machines in a room with no cards on the window, and something in his 9-year-old chest. The same chest that had absorbed his father's death 8 months ago without fully understanding it yet, recognized something. "I'll come back tomorrow," he told the man, as if the man had asked him to, as if there had been any negotiation at all. "I'm not done with the mean landlord guy." He was gone before Nurse Ha-yoon could stop him. small sneakers slapping down the corridor toward the stairwell, leaving her alone with a monitor that had, for 11 minutes, told a story none of the machines had ever told before. If you felt something twist in your chest picturing an empty hospital room with no flowers, no cards, nobody hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what do you think it says about a man that not one person from his own family bothered to visit him in 4 months? Now, let's find out how he got there. 9 years earlier, Han Tae-young had been a different kind of quiet, the quiet of a man who filled a room simply by entering it, who didn't need to raise his voice, because 40 years of building the Jinsung Group from a single steel fabrication yard into a conglomerate with 12 subsidiaries had taught him that the loudest man in a negotiation was usually the one about to lose it. He kept 3 habits that had outlived every assistant, every board reshuffle, every year of his life. He drank his coffee black and cold, never hot, a preference he'd never explained to anyone. He carried in the left breast pocket of every suit he owned a small folded photograph, soft at the creases from 20 years of handling. And every evening, without fail, he asked his driver to take the long way home past Seorak Elementary School, even though it added 11 minutes to the drive and he had no reason in the world to pass a school with no children of his own waiting inside it. The photograph was of a girl, 9 years old, gap-toothed, mid-laugh, caught by the camera in the exact half-second before she realized she was being photographed and struck a pose instead. Her name had been Han Tae-young. She had died of a rare form of childhood leukemia 14 years ago, 3 weeks after her 9th birthday, in a hospital bed not unlike the one Tae-young himself would one day occupy. His wife, unable to survive the shape of the house afterward, the particular silence of a bedroom that no longer needed a nightlight, had left 2 years later, not dramatically, not with blame. Just a slow withdrawal that ended in a quiet divorce and a life lived on the other side of the world, in Vancouver, where she ran a small flower shop and sent Tae-young a card every year on Ha-eun's birthday that he never answered and never threw away. He had built an empire, in the years after, the way some men build walls. His driver of 12 years, a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken man named Kim Dae-hyun, was the only person who'd ever seen him take the photograph out of his pocket and simply look at it. Parked outside the gates of the company's Yangjae headquarters at 6 in the morning, before the building woke up around him. "You never talk about her," Dae-hyun said once, not really a question. "There's nothing to say," Tae-young answered, which was the closest he ever came, in 12 years, to saying everything. Dae-hyun had a son of his own by then, a small, restless boy named Jiho, 4 years old at the time, who Tae-young had met exactly twice, both times in the driveway, both times for less than a minute, and both times had felt something close to physical pain looking at him, because the boy was loud and alive and exactly the age his own daughter had been before the diagnosis had started counting down. "He asks about you," Dae-hyun said once, laughing a little. "I told him I drive for a very important dragon who lives in a glass building. He wants to meet you." "Don't bring him around," Tae-young had said, too fast, too sharp, and had seen something close down in Dae-hyun's face before the driver nodded and let it go. It was the only unkind thing Tae-young ever remembered saying to him. Meanwhile, in the glass building Dae-hyun's son imagined as a dragon's lair, a different kind of family was arranging itself around Han Tae-young, one built entirely out of usefulness. His late sister's son, Han Min-jae, had been brought into the company at 26, after failing at 2 ventures his father had bankrolled, installed as chief operating officer more out of family obligation than confidence. Min-jae was sharp in the way a knife left unused gets sharp bitter, resentful of a decade spent being reminded he'd been given his position rather than earned it, and increasingly convinced that his uncle's stubborn private grief was simply weakness dressed up as discipline. "He'll run this company into the ground with his sentimentality," Min-jae told the board's senior director, a cool, calculating man named Director Oh Sung-tae, over drinks the two of them had taken to having without Tae-young's knowledge. Passing over 3 profitable acquisitions this year alone, because he doesn't like how the workers were treated at the target company? That's not business. That's a man who lost a child pretending the whole company owes something to every child in Korea. Careful, Oh said, though he didn't disagree. He built this. You didn't. He built it 14 years ago, Min-jae said. He's been running it on inertia ever since. It was a lie small enough to feel true if you said it often enough. And Min-jae had been saying it, quietly, to the right people, for almost 2 years. The apartment Kim Soo-ah shared with her son was small, one room, and a kitchen the size of a closet, in a building on the wrong side of Eunpyeong, where the hot water worked on alternating days. She cleaned laundry and linens on the night shift at Seorok Medical Center, 6 nights a week, and had done so for the 8 months since her husband died in a car accident, whose details she had never fully explained to Ji-ho, because she herself did not entirely understand them. She knew this. Dae-hyun had been driving Chairman Han Tae-young back from a groundbreaking ceremony in Incheon, on a wet March evening when the brakes had failed on a downhill curve. She knew that the official report called it mechanical failure, a corroded brake line, an unlucky combination of rain and age, and a maintenance schedule that had, for reasons no one in the transportation department could adequately explain, been pushed back twice that year. She knew that her husband had wrenched the wheel hard, right at the last possible second, taking the impact against a guardrail on the passenger's side instead of head-on into the oncoming truck, and that this single decision, made in perhaps 0.4 of a second, had killed him and left the chairman with a traumatic brain injury and a coma from which no one, not the specialists flown in, from Seoul National University Hospital, not the neurologist from Boston who'd reviewed his scans over video call, could promise he would ever wake. She knew the company had paid for the funeral. She knew they had sent a very large, very formal wreath, and a check, and a letter from the legal department expressing the chairman's family's condolences, though the chairman himself had, of course, been unable to sign it. She did not know that her husband's last words, radioed in on the car's hands-free line to dispatch 4 seconds before impact, had been, "Tell my boy I," before the transmission cut to static. She would not learn this for 4 more months. What she knew was this. Her son had stopped sleeping through the night sometime in April. He drew pictures of a green dinosaur and a man in a tie and taped them above his bed. He had started, without telling her, going up to the 11th floor. "You can't keep doing this," she told him. The evening nurse Ha-yoon found her in the break room and gently explained, with more kindness than the situation strictly required, that her son had been visiting room 1109 for 6 straight days. "That's the chairman's room, Ji-ho. That's the most important man in this whole hospital's wing. If his family finds out a boy's been sneaking in there..." "He doesn't have any family," Ji-ho said, with the flat certainty of a 9-year-old who has appointed himself the arbiter of fairness in the universe. "Nobody comes. I checked the book at the desk. Nobody's name is in it except a lawyer, twice." Soo-ah didn't have an answer for that. She thought of her own husband's funeral, and the sparse, awkward crowd of company employees who'd shown up out of obligation rather than love, standing at a careful distance from her and Ji-ho as if grief were contagious, and something in her chest, tired, grieving, and threadbare as it was recognized the shape of what her son was doing before she was willing to name it. 5 more minutes tomorrow," she said. "And if a nurse tells you to leave, you leave. Do you understand me?" "Okay," Ji-ho said, already reaching for his backpack, already thinking about which volume of Dooley he'd bring next. He did not, in fact, ever manage to keep his visits to 5 minutes. By the 2nd week, he was staying for 40. By the 3rd, he had started bringing a small battery-powered radio and playing an old trot song he'd found on his father's phone, a song, though he had no way of knowing this, that Han Tae-young's late wife had once sung to their daughter, off-key and laughing, in a hospital room 14 years and 1 floor away from the one Ji-ho now sat in. The first time it played, Nurse Ha-yoon, checking vitals, watched Chairman Han's resting brain activity spike on the monitor in a pattern the attending neurologist would later describe, carefully and without commitment, as not inconsistent with auditory processing. She didn't tell the boy. She wasn't sure yet what it meant, but she started leaving the door to room 1109 unlocked for him every afternoon at 4, and never once wrote his name in the visitor log. By the fourth month, the Jinsung Group's board had stopped pretending the chairman's absence was temporary in anything but the paperwork. We need a resolution on interim executive authority. Director Oh said at a closed-door session that Min Jae had spent 3 weeks quietly engineering. The chairman has been incapacitated for 119 days. The bylaws are clear. Beyond 120, the board may vote to transfer full operational control to a designated successor, pending the chairman's recovery, or a formal declaration of incapacity by 2 independent physicians. 120 days is Thursday, Min Jae said, with the studied gravity of a man who had in fact memorized the exact date weeks ago. I don't say this lightly. I love my uncle, but the Nakwon shipbuilding acquisition alone is worth 400 billion won, and it expires if we don't move by month's end. Someone has to make these calls. It should be someone who understands what he would have wanted. What Han Tae-young would have wanted, as it happened, was the one thing Min Jae had spent 2 years making sure the board never heard directly from Tae-young's own mouth. That the Nakwon acquisition, which would have required laying off 600 shipyard workers in GOJ and folding their pension fund into Jinsung's more aggressive investment structure, was exactly the kind of deal Tae-young had refused twice before. On the record, in board minutes, Min Jae had quietly reclassified as preliminary discussion, non-binding. Director Oh, for his part, believed Min Jae's economics but not his motives, and had begun to suspect, though he had no proof, and told no one that the brake failure report had been finalized with unusual speed, and that the maintenance contractor responsible had, 6 weeks after the accident, received a new and considerably larger contract for Jinsung's northern logistics fleet, personally approved by then newly empowered COO Han Min Jae. He said nothing about this at the meeting. He was not yet certain enough to say it anywhere. We vote Thursday, Min Jae said, and the board, tired of 3 months of paralysis and genuinely worried about the company's exposed contracts, murmured its assent. That evening, Min Jae's lawyer, a precise, unsmiling woman named Attorney Bae, brought him a different kind of problem. There's a boy, she said, sliding a photograph across the desk, taken by hospital security and obtained through channels she did not specify, visiting room 1109 nearly every day. Staff logs show he's been in there over 3 weeks, no visitor authorization. Hospital administration is aware and has apparently been letting it slide. Min Jae studied the photograph, a small boy in a backpack, laughing at something out of frame. Who is he? Kim Ji-ho, Attorney Bae said, son of Kim Dae-hyun. Min Jae's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The driver. The driver? Bae confirmed. There's also this. She placed a second document on the desk, a preliminary insurance inquiry, filed by the driver's widow's attorney 8 months ago, and quietly closed for lack of evidence, asking whether the vehicle's brake maintenance records could be independently reviewed. It went nowhere, Bae added. The widow didn't pursue it. No money for a protracted legal fight, presumably. Min Jae was quiet for a long moment, turning the photograph of the boy over in his hands like it might tell him something the way it hadn't the first time. Make sure it stays closed, he said finally, and get someone to talk to her. Quietly. Before Thursday, Attorney Bae found Kim Sua on a Tuesday in the small break room on the 3rd floor and introduced herself as representing parties concerned with the chairman's ongoing care and privacy. Your son has been visiting a patient he isn't authorized to see, Bae said, laying a folder on the table between them, not threatening. Exactly, just precise, the way a scalpel is precise. I understand it comes from a good place. Children process grief in unusual ways, but the chairman is a very prominent man, and his condition is a matter of significant corporate sensitivity. I'm authorized to offer you a settlement. She slid a document across the table. The number on it made Sua's breath catch before she could stop it enough to clear the debt from Dae-hyun's funeral, enough for 6 months of not choosing between the electric bill and Ji-ho's school supplies. Enough, possibly, to finally move out of the building with the alternating hot water. In exchange for what? Sua said, and it wasn't really a question. A simple agreement, Bae said. Your son stops visiting, and you formally withdraw any prior inquiry into the vehicle maintenance records from the accident. I understand your previous attorney made such a request. We'd want that closed permanently, with prejudice, as part of the arrangement. Sua looked at the number for a long moment. She thought about the hot water. She thought about Ji-ho's shoes, the left one, with the sole starting to peel. She thought about 8 months of night shifts that left her so tired she sometimes cried in the stairwell where he couldn't see her, and how easy it would be to simply nod, sign, and never have to do that again. Then, she thought about her husband's voice. She didn't have the actual last words yet. Wouldn't, for 3 more months. But she had 8 months of every ordinary thing he'd ever said to her, and none of them had ever once been for sale. Why would you need me to give up asking about the brakes? She said slowly. Unless there's something in those records you don't want anyone looking at? Bae's expression didn't move, which was, in its own way, an answer. I'm not signing anything, Sua said, and slid the folder back across the table. And you can tell whoever sent you that my son is going to keep reading that man his comic books, and there is nothing in that folder that changes that. It was, on paper, an act of enormous financial foolishness by a woman with 40,000 won in her checking account and rent due in 9 days. She did not tell Ji-ho about the offer, then or ever, in the version of this story he would grow up knowing. She told no one at all, actually, except the empty stairwell, where she allowed herself, once, to sit down on the cold concrete step and shake for exactly 4 minutes before wiping her face and going back to work. She did not know that this refusal, small, private, entirely unwitnessed, was the single decision that would matter most in everything that came after. That same week, on the 11th floor, Ji-ho arrived at 4 o'clock as always, and found the door to room 1109, not just unlocked, but standing wide open, with a man in an expensive gray suit already standing beside the bed. You're the boy, Han Min-jae said, without turning around. The driver's son, Ji-ho, who did not yet know what an acquisitions timeline was or what 400 billion won meant, only knew that this man's voice had the same careful, cold politeness his mother used with debt collectors on the phone. I'm Ji-ho, he said. I know who you are. Min-jae finally turned. He looked at the boy for a long moment, and something crossed his face that might, in a kinder man, have been guilt, and in Min-jae was closer to irritation at being made to feel it. You should stop coming here. He doesn't have anybody else, Ji-ho said. You're his family. Why don't you come? The question landed harder than Min-jae expected from a 9-year-old. He looked at his uncle's slack, unmoving face, the face that had, for 2 years, watched Min-jae fail at ventures and rescued him from each one, with a mixture of disappointment and grim family duty that Min-jae had never once mistaken for warmth, and felt the specific, ugly vertigo of being asked to justify himself by a child. It's complicated, he said, which was the same lie every adult in this story told Ji-ho, and which Ji-ho had, by now, learned to recognize on sight. That's not an answer, Ji-ho said. Min-jae left without responding, and did not return to room 1109 again for what remained of the 4 months. But he did not have Ji-ho barred from the hospital either. Not yet. Some small and uncomfortable part of him unwilling to be the man who did that to a boy whose father had died protecting his uncle. It was, though he would never call it this, the first small crack in a plan he had otherwise built without a single hesitation. If you're starting to suspect Ji-ho's father's death wasn't the accident everyone was told it was, hit, like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me who you think is really behind those breaks. I want to see your theories before the truth comes out. Now, back to the story. Director Oh Sung-tae had not survived 30 years in Korean corporate governance by trusting convenient timelines, and the speed of the original brake failure report had been bothering him for months in the specific, low-grade way that eventually makes a careful man start pulling threads on his own time. It was Oh, not Attorney Bae's clumsy attempt at a payoff, that finally cracked the case open because Oh had quietly requested, back in April, that the vehicle's onboard dashcam and telemetry unit, recovered from the wreck and sealed as evidence, be independently forensically reviewed by a lab with no contract ties to Jin Sung's insurance provider. The results came back in the second week of July, 3 days before the board's scheduled vote on interim executive authority. The footage showed what everyone already knew: the wet road, the curve, Dae-hyun's hands white on the wheel as the pedal went soft beneath his foot. But the telemetry data showed something new. A maintenance log entry, timestamped 6 weeks before the accident, flagging the brake line for replacement, and a second entry, 12 hours later, overriding the flag as resolved, inspected, cleared for service. Signed off not by the maintenance technician who'd filed the original flag, but by a supervisor who reported directly to the transportation department. Han Min-jae had reorganized under his own authority 18 months earlier. Oh, sat with the report for 2 full days before he did anything with it, because what it suggested, not proved, not yet, but suggested with an ugliness that made his hands unsteady reading it, was that someone had known the brakes were failing and had signed off on the car going out anyway, and that the man in that car had been the chairman himself. He thought about who benefited from Han Tae-young never waking up. He thought about who had been positioning, quietly and patiently, for 18 months, to be exactly where he needed to be if the chairman never woke up. He thought about a photograph of a small boy that Attorney Bae had shown the board's compliance officer, framed as evidence of a security concern, and how strange it was that a company lawyer had needed hospital surveillance footage of a 9-year-old at all. Oh made one phone call to a compliance officer he trusted and asked a single question: whether anyone had recently approved unusual expenditure connected to the transportation department's maintenance contractor. The answer, when it came back that evening, made him lock the report in his home safe and cancel his dinner plans. 6 weeks after the accident, the maintenance contractor, the same one whose supervisor had overridden the brake flag, had been awarded a new 3-year logistics contract worth 11 times its previous annual revenue from Jin-sung. The approval signature belonged to Han Min-jae. The board convened on Thursday morning in the Glass Tower's 18th floor conference room, and for the first 40 minutes, it looked exactly like the false ending this story was always going to offer before snatching it away. Min-jae, composed and rehearsed, presented a case for interim executive authority that was, on its surface, entirely reasonable. A company that had drifted for 4 months, contracts at risk, employees anxious, a chairman whose doctors, when pressed, could offer no meaningful timeline for recovery, and privately, though never on the record, used words like persistent vegetative state. In hallway conversations Min-jae had made sure reached the right ears. "I don't do this out of ambition," Min-jae told the room, and it was, disturbingly, at least 40% true. "I do this because someone has to hold this company together while my uncle isn't here to do it. He would understand that better than anyone." Director Oh watched from the far end of the table and said nothing through the entire presentation, which Min-jae would later understand had been the single worst miscalculation of his life, mistaking Oh's silence for agreement rather than what it actually was, which was a man waiting for the vote count to begin so the record would show, unambiguously, exactly who had tried to push it through. All in favor of granting interim executive authority to COO Han Min-jae, effective immediately, the board secretary read, pending formal review at the 90-day mark. 6 hands went up. It needed 7 of 11, all opposed. 4 hands, including Oh's. The room turned, as these things do, to the 11th member, an elderly, semi-retired founding director named Chairman Yu, who had said almost nothing in 4 months of meetings, and whom everyone, including Min-jae, had assumed would abstain out of sheer institutional exhaustion. Chairman Yu looked at Min-jae for a long moment, and then, quietly, said, "I'd like the vote postponed 1 week." It was not a no. It was, in the story Min-jae told himself, for the next 7 days, essentially a yes with paperwork, a decoy victory, so convincing that he opened a bottle of wine that night and, for the first time in 18 months, allowed himself to imagine the company as unambiguously his. He did not know that Director Oh had asked Chairman Yu, in a private conversation 40 minutes before the meeting, for exactly this delay, not to stop the vote, but to buy 1 week to finish confirming what the dashcam telemetry had already told him in outline. The week that followed was, by any honest accounting, the darkest of the entire 4 months for nearly everyone in this story at once, which is precisely how the worst weeks tend to arrange themselves. Hospital administration. Under quiet pressure from Attorney Bay's office and citing security protocols following an unauthorized visitor review, formally revoked Jiho's access to the 11th floor. Nurse Ha-yoon fought it as far as she was permitted to fight anything as a third-year nurse with no institutional power, and lost. "I'm sorry," she told Jiho, crouching to his height in the hospital lobby, her own eyes wet in a way she was embarrassed by. "I tried. They said it's a liability issue. I can't let you up there anymore." "But I'm not done with the book," Jiho said, and something in his small, stricken face broke something in Ha-yoon that 4 years of nursing school had not prepared her for. "I know," she said. "I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." Kim Soo-ah, called in to collect her sobbing son from the lobby, understood immediately with the particular clarity of a woman who had refused a bribe 6 days earlier exactly whose hand this was. She said nothing to hospital administration, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't cost her the job she desperately needed, and instead sat with Jiho on a bench outside the building until he stopped crying, which took considerably longer than either of them expected. "He's going to wake up alone," Jiho said finally, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Nobody's even going to be there. That's not fair." "I know," Sua said, and did not have anything better to offer him, because for the first time in 8 months of forced optimism for her son's sake, she genuinely did not believe things were going to be okay. 2 floors up, unbeknownst to either of them, Chairman Han Tae-young's vital signs steady for the better part of 3 weeks, ever since a small radio had started playing an old, off-key trot song every afternoon at 4 o'clock, had begun, subtly but measurably, to decline. His resting heart rate crept upward. His attending physician noted, in a chart she did not yet know how to explain to anyone, a decrease in what limited responsive brain activity they'd been tracking, coinciding, though she had no way of connecting it, almost exactly with the date a 9-year-old had stopped coming to room 1109. Nurse Ha-yoon, reviewing the chart alone that night, did the thing she had told herself for 3 weeks she wouldn't do, out of professional caution and a healthy fear of losing her license. She called Kim Soo-ah's cell phone directly, off the record, after her own shift ended. "I think your son needs to come back," she said, without preamble. "I can't explain it in a way that would hold up to anyone above me. But I think it's true, and I think if we wait for someone else to believe me, it might be too late." Getting Jiho back onto the 11th floor required Nurse Ha-yoon to do something that could, in the worst case, end her career. She signed him in under a false pretense, listing him as a family-authorized companion visit using an old, unrevoked authorization code from the week before the ban. At 11 at night, when the floor was nearly empty and the one security guard on duty was a friend of her older brother's who asked no questions. Jiho did not fully understand the risk Ha-yoon was taking. He understood only that the door to room 1109 was open again, and he ran to the chair he'd come to think of as his and pulled his comic book out with hands that were shaking slightly, though he couldn't have said from what. "I'm back," he told the man in the bed, breathless. "I'm sorry it took so long. Some stuff happened. I'll explain later. Or, I guess you already know, huh? You've probably heard everything the whole time and just can't say anything back." He opened the comic to the page he'd left off on, weeks ago now, and started reading the mean landlord's voice, Dooley's voice, cracking a little on the 3rd page for reasons that had nothing to do with the story. He did not notice, at first, the small object that had slipped loose from beneath the chairman's pillow when Ha-yoon repositioned him earlier that evening, a thin gold locket on a broken chain, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, which had fallen onto the blanket near Jiho's hand. He picked it up without thinking, the way children pick up anything within reach, and opened it out of pure reflex. Inside was a photograph. A girl, 9 years old, gap-toothed, laughing. Jiho stared at it for a long time. "She looks like she'd have been fun," he said finally, very quietly. in the voice he used when he was talking about his father, careful, like the words might break something if he said them wrong. "Is this your daughter?" The monitor beside the bed, for the first time in 4 months, registered a spike in brain activity that the attending neurologist, called in at midnight by a panicked nurse Ha-yoon who genuinely believed she'd made a terrible mistake, would later describe as unprecedented for this patient's baseline, a pattern consistent, she said carefully, choosing every word, with a person trying and failing and trying again to surface toward consciousness. "Sir?" Ha-yoon said, leaning over the bed, her voice sharp with a hope she was afraid to fully feel. "Chairman Han? Can you hear me?" Han Tae-young's eyelids did not open that night, but his right hand, which had not moved on its own in 131 days, closed slowly, faintly, unmistakably around the small fingers of a 9-year-old boy holding his daughter's photograph. If your chest just did something reading that hand close around his hit, like, "Subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you think he can hear everything that's been said in that room for 4 months? I need to know I'm not the only one holding my breath. Now, let's finish this." Director Oh finished his forensic case on a Wednesday and walked into the reconvened board meeting the following Thursday with a folder considerably thicker than the one he'd carried the week before: telemetry logs, the overridden maintenance flag, the contractor's inflated new contract, and a sworn statement from the technician who'd originally flagged the brake line and been quietly transferred to a regional office within a month of the accident, silenced not through threat but through the much more common corporate tool of a promotion he'd been too afraid to refuse. "Before we resume the vote," Oh said, standing rather than remaining seated, which was itself a break in 30 years of boardroom habit sharp enough to make the room go still, "I'd like the board to review something." He did not accuse anyone by name. He simply read the timeline aloud, the flag, the override, the contract, the dates, laid end to end so that the shape of them formed a sentence no one in the room needed, spelled out further. Min Jae's face, watching his carefully built inevitability come apart in real time in front of 11 people whose approval he'd spent 18 months engineering, went through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, calculation, and finally, when Chairman Yu asked quietly whether Min Jae wished to respond, something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for so long that even its violent public unveiling feels, in the first raw seconds, like being allowed to put it down. "I didn't order anyone hurt," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that would have sounded, to a kinder observer, almost like the truth. "I told them to push the maintenance timeline back because the fleet renewal budget was already stretched. And I told the contractor I'd make it worth their while if they signed off fast so the Nakwon deal could move on schedule. I didn't think," he stopped. "I didn't think it would be him driving that day." It was not, in the strictest legal sense, a confession to attempted murder. It was, in the much more human sense that mattered to everyone in that room, exactly that. "That's my uncle," Min Jae said, quieter now, to no one in particular. "I never wanted this." "You wanted the company," Oh said, not unkindly, "and you were willing to let the timeline decide who paid for it. That man's driver paid for it with his life. A 9-year-old boy paid for it by growing up without a father. I don't think you get to stand here and tell us you never wanted this, Min Jae. You built the whole last 18 months wanting exactly this." The board voted, this time, unanimously, not to grant Min Jae interim authority, but to suspend him pending formal investigation, and to authorize Director Oh, as senior remaining executive, to serve as caretaker chairman while criminal referral proceedings were prepared. The story might have ended there, in a conference room, with the private, bloodless justice of corporate governance, except that at 4:47 that afternoon, while security was still escorting Han Min Jae's belongings out of the executive suite he had occupied for exactly 1 contested week, Nurse Ha-yoon's phone rang from the 11th floor with 3 words that turned the entire day into something else entirely. "He's waking up." It happened, in the end, in front of witnesses which the framework of this whole story, in its own quiet way, had been building toward from the first unresolved 11 minutes on that first monitor. Han Tae-young's eyes opened at 5:02 p.m., 3 minutes after Kim Soo-ah, summoned by a nurse who had promised herself she'd never again let a boy's father miss the chance to be present for something this large, arrived at the hospital with Ji-ho's hand gripped tight in hers. Having sprinted the last 2 blocks from the bus stop, by the time they reached the 11th floor, a small, astonished crowd of hospital staff had gathered in the hallway, outside room 1109, not press, not yet. Though a reporter tipped off by an intern would arrive within the hour and the story would be on every major Korean news outlet by morning, under headlines that would, within a week, all converge on some version of the same sentence: the boy who talked a chairman awake. Ji-ho pushed through the small crowd and stopped in the doorway, suddenly, uncharacteristically shy, looking at a man whose eyes were open for the first time since he'd started visiting, and who was looking back at him with the slow, disoriented, overwhelming effort of someone surfacing from very deep water. "Hi," Ji-ho said in a voice much smaller than his usual one. "I brought the next book. I don't know if you remember, but we were at the part where Dooley gets thrown out of the house again." Han Tae-young's mouth moved, cracked, and unused, forming sounds that took several attempts to become words. "The landlord," he managed finally, barely audible, "is a terrible man." It was not eloquent. It was not, by any professional accounting, even certain proof of full cognitive recovery. The attending neurologist would spend the next several days running exactly the tests needed to confirm that. But it was, unmistakably, the first complete sentence Han Tae-young had spoken in 138 days, and it was about a comic book a 9-year-old had been reading to him since before either of them knew the other's name. Kim Soo-ah, standing in the doorway with her hand still locked around her son's, felt something break open in her chest that she had been holding rigid since March. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first loosening of a fear she hadn't let herself name until this exact moment, watching a stranger's eyes focus, slowly, on her son's face, with an expression that could only be described as recognition, though the two of them had, by any official measure, never properly met. "You're the boy's mother," Tae-young said, later that evening, once speech had come back to him more fully. Once the room had cleared of the specialists and the odd junior staff who kept finding excuses to walk past the open door. He was looking at Soo-ah now, and something in his face, carved by 14 years of a grief he'd never let anyone near, was working very hard to say something it did not have practiced words for. "Your husband, Dae-hyun," Soo-ah said softly. "He turned the wheel," Tae-young said, and his eyes, still adjusting to 4 months of darkness, filled anyway. "I remember it now. I remember the wheel turning," he said. He stopped, the effort of the memory visibly costing him something. He said my name, not a warning, just my name. Like he wanted to make sure I heard it before. He couldn't finish it. He didn't need to. Soo-ah, who had spent 8 months not knowing her husband's final act, sat down slowly in the chair Ji-ho had occupied for so many afternoons, and let herself, for the first time since the funeral, cry in front of someone who understood exactly the weight of what she'd lost, because he had, in the same 4/10 of a second, nearly lost his own life to it. "Your son sat with me," Tae-young said, when he could speak again, "for 4 months. Nobody in my own family did that. Not once." His hand found the locket, still resting on the blanket where it had fallen days before, and closed around it. "I heard every word he read. I don't know how. But I heard all of it. The mean landlord. The song your husband used to hum, I think, before—" He stopped again. "I heard it all." The Jin Sung Group's annual shareholder address, held that October in the Glass Tower's largest auditorium, was, by long-standing company tradition, a dry affair. Quarterly earnings, subsidiary performance, the kind of speech written by 3 committees and delivered by a chairman who read it like a man serving a sentence. Han Tae-young, 6 weeks out of the hospital, walking still with a cane he expected to need for another few months, tore up the prepared remarks in front of 400 shareholders and the assembled press corps that had been covering the Miracle Chairman story for 2 months running. "I built this company," he said, "on the theory that the numbers were the whole story. I spent 14 years believing that if I built something large enough and successful enough, it would be enough that I didn't need anyone standing beside me to make it matter." He paused, found Sua and Ji-ho in the third row, where he had personally arranged for them to sit. "I was wrong. It took a 9-year-old boy who had lost his own father to teach me that a company, or a life, built entirely on distance from other people isn't strength. It's just a very well-funded way of being alone." He announced, that afternoon, the Kim Dae-hyun Memorial Fund, a scholarship and housing initiative for the families of Jin Sung employees who died in service. Funded not out of corporate obligation this time, but out of a personal endowment Tae-young established the week he left the hospital, before any lawyer had told him it would look good in the press. He announced Han Min-jae's formal termination and the referral of his conduct to prosecutors, delivered without cruelty and without excusing it either. "He mistook control for love, the way I mistook distance for strength, and only one of us gets a second chance to learn better, because only one of us built his mistake on someone else's life." And in the small, unscripted moment that would end up clipped and shared more than any other part of the speech, he asked Ji-ho, sitting in the third row in a suit his mother had bought second-hand and pressed twice, to stand. "This is the young man," Tae-young said, "who is the only reason I am standing here at all. I don't have adequate words for what I owe him. So instead of words, I'd like to make him an offer in front of everyone in this room, so he can't accuse me later of complicating it." He smiled, the expression still a little unfamiliar on a face that had spent 14 years guarding against exactly this kind of visibility. "Ji-ho, your father gave me my life back once, without expecting anything for it. I would like the chance, for as long as I have left, to make sure you and your mother never again have to choose between paying rent and asking for help. Not charity. A family choosing to show up for each other, if you'll have me." Ji-ho, standing in front of 400 shareholders and 4 camera crews, thought about it for exactly as long as a 9-year-old thinks about anything important, which is to say, not very long at all. "Only if you actually read me the next book yourself," he said. "I'm getting kind of tired of doing all the voices." The room laughed, the first real, unguarded laugh the Jin Sung boardroom had produced in longer than most of the people in it could remember, and Han Tae-young, gripping his cane in one hand and, for the cameras and for himself, his daughter's locket in the other, said that, yes, he thought he could manage that. If this story wrecked you the way it wrecked me writing it, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what's the one small, ordinary kindness someone showed you when you needed it most, that you never got the chance to properly thank them for? I want to read every single one.